Thank you, Sydney. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Hall, and on behalf of Bullfinch Benefits and Pinnacle HR, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today is the first day, or the first in a series of ongoing events to assist everyone in preparing for the new normal. For today, we are very pleased to be joined by Arden O'Connor of the O'Connor Professional Group to share her thoughts on recognizing and managing anxiety in the remote workplace. Arden?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. Just for context purposes, I run a company called O'Connor Professional Group. We're a behavioral health navigation service. So you can see on the bottom of the slide that we serve folks. We are hired by families, by individuals, and by employers who are struggling with a large cadre of issues in the behavioral health category. So that can be addictions of various sorts, substance abuse probably being the most common, but we certainly deal with people with sexual compulsivity, gambling issues, an array of mental health diagnoses from anxiety, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, depression through bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder. We also work with folks who have eating disorders and autism spectrum disorder. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I think is probably impacting all of us to varying degrees, which is managing anxiety in the remote workplace. And just so you have a sense of the content of the presentation, we're going to start out just giving some history about anxiety, how it affects the population, the ways we see it in people, a little bit of context around COVID-19 specifically, and how that's contributing to anxiety among folks that may be in your workplace. We're going to talk about some strategies to use in the workplace. And at the end, if we have some time, I'm going to talk about some evidence-based ways and some more creative ways to look at treating anxiety that might be more applicable to those in your personal network. And we'll hopefully have some time at the end for questions. I'm going to do my best to talk slowly. I tend to be a fast talker, but that will leave some more time for questions at the end. So I'd like to open up by saying, I think, one of the things that has come out of this, I'm sure as many of the folks on the phone have been in quarantine for some period of time, many of us, at least I will speak for myself, are starting to feel a little bit of cabin fever. And we're noticing varying reactions within our client population. Some of our clients, this is a time where they're really struggling, and some people, this is a time where they're thriving. And I think what's interesting is we're seeing the same out in the world. So we're seeing companies that have CEOs giving up salaries for portions of time so that they don't have to furlough or lay off any of their employees. We're seeing companies that are stepping up to the plate in ways that are unprecedented with their employees. We are also seeing individuals. I was watching the news recently, and I watched basically a stream of cars waiting to get into basically a drive-through food drive. And all I could think of is, these folks are waiting hours upon hours to get food to bring to their families, and God bless the volunteers in those lines who are willing to get out there, risk their health, be patient, and offer some hope to people who are really struggling. So we are seeing some of the best humanity in action that is possibly imaginable. On the other end of the spectrum, we are seeing some irrationality in action. My family has a home in Long Island, New York. My father actually said at one point that he was thinking he may go there just for a change of pace, a change of scenery. And luckily I had the article on the left handy, and I forwarded him that link, which basically described shoppers going into the grocery stores, spending $8,000 a trip, taking all the chicken, all the steak, all the fish, leaving nothing for future grocery shoppers to be able to use. And some of that speaks to, some of it basically speaks to entitlement and certain personality characteristics, but I think a big component of it is also the way that anxiety manifests itself within folks. So we're going to see both extremes in the human population during a crisis like this, and some of that is going to depend on an individual's own ability to be resilient during this time and use positive coping skills. So I want to talk a little bit about understanding anxiety. And I think anxiety is an interesting clinical definition because we hear it a lot. Everybody talks about being anxious in the public media, and now it's more in the public mainframe than any other time before. And there is really a range. I'm not a clinician. I have a team of therapists who work with me. The way I sort of distinguish between types of anxiety is pretty simple. So there are folks with what we call situational anxiety. So COVID-19 makes them nervous about the health and welfare of their family. They're concerned about the economic implications, but it's really caused by a specific event that happened. And COVID-19 is one example, but it could be someone being anxious about the loss of a partner, the loss of a job. Then there are folks who have what's called generalized anxiety disorder, and that's something where it's not traceable to a specific event. It's just a feeling that they have a lot of the time. And so as employers or people in HR departments, I think it's important to understand, what is a sign of an employee who may be struggling with anxiety. So, if you look at the emotional symptoms, they may be harder to detect. So excessive or irrational fear, trouble concentrating. I think there are a lot of firms that are seeing a decrease in productivity right now because people are distracted either by their competing obligations in the home and at work, or by, frankly, the onslaught of news and social media that's coming their way. So they're having a hard time getting one project done at a time. Certainly, we see a lot of folks in our practice who are ruminating and are slightly irritable. I think if you look at the physical symptoms, those are obviously more detectable, with the last three in the bold area really being signs of somebody almost close to what we would envision as a panic attack, somebody who's experiencing shortness of breath, sweating, feeling weak and tired. And, at these moments when we're concerned about COVID symptoms, it's interesting that many of those signs sort of mirror what people are telling you to go to the hospital for if you think you might have COVID. One reason that we're seeing such an uptick in anxiety, and the Kaiser Family Foundation actually, interestingly, just put out a report. There was a New York Times op-ed that quoted their study that I think said that they surveyed adults, and whereas 10% of the population typically is assumed to experience a mental illness, during these times, 45% of the adult population that they surveyed is reporting that they are feeling anxious. And a lot of that is due to uncertainty. So the study here in this slide is discussing people who were getting shocks, and basically the people who knew that they were getting shocks fared better than those who were unsure whether or not they were going to be shocked. It's not electric shock in the way we think about it in the clinical setting. It was just a quick shock to your hand. But the idea that you were either going to sit there and not know whether you were going to get the shock or not caused more anxiety than actually knowing you were going to get something that might be uncomfortable. And what's interesting is I think this slide mirrors what we see in outcomes for children. I used to run a home for foster care kids, and they used to say that some of the worst psychological outcomes came from children who had parents who on one day could be very loving and on the next day could be abusive or neglectful, that they actually fared worse than children who learned not to depend on their parents at all, who were just consistently abusive or neglectful. We certainly see in our practice and in the world different manifestations of anxiety. Some people clamp down, some people kind of try to become very productive. I will tell you that in our practice, we have a client right now in the New York City area. The major amount of work that our firm has done with her has been around getting her integrated into the world, back doing activities that she loves, going out to music events, going out to engage in yoga. And right now she is actually thriving because she has social anxiety. So right now she has basically a condoned reason to remain in her home. So in addition to these various manifestations of anxiety, it's important to consider that for some people, this is very comfortable. They're in their sweatpants, they're online playing games, they don't have to interact with people. And where we will see an uptick in some of those symptoms is when we get back to whatever the new normal is, and they have to go back and re-engage with the world. So a lot of the questions we get from folks who refer into our practice, employers, parents, other folks out in the community, is sort of, when do you know whether or not you need to seek professional help? There are a lot of people who live with a certain level of anxiety, and in some people, actually, anxiety can be very productive. Entrepreneurs, for instance, are often very anxious about competition. They're anxious that they're not living up to what their own expectations are, and that can cause them to strive for better. I think the way we think about it, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, is somebody really struggling with committing to basic activities in their life? Are they having trouble with what we call ADL, so daily living activities? Is sleep impacted? Are all of a sudden we seeing major changes in their job performance? Do things like yoga or tennis or other activities that they used to do become less pleasurable, and are they struggling to complete basic tasks? That's a sign that they may be anxious to a degree that would require professional help. Some of the other questions we ask folks to think about are, have you tried meditating and that's not been successful? Certainly we're on the lookout because we deal with a lot of clients who struggle with substance abuse. This is a time, I think liquor sales are hitting record highs, for a whole host of reasons, including people being coped up inside. But for somebody who's anxious, it doesn't mean never have a glass of wine. It does mean think through if every time you get anxious is having a glass of wine or a drink the only way you're coping with it, or do you have other strategies, taking a walk, spending time with a pet or a child? I'd probably say the two that are the most important to look at on the slide are one is, has somebody suggested that you get help? The average person in the world does not like to have to suggest getting professional help. I know for me, even though I have a background in business, I have a lot of colleagues who have gone through their own personal struggles. I have been very open about the fact that I've seen a therapist for years. And even when I think someone would benefit, I take a pause and think about that person's personality, because for some people, it's suggestive that you think there's something wrong with them. So if somebody actually is concerned enough that they're bringing an issue to the forefront, it usually means that the issue is pretty significant. And then we also look at duration. If somebody's symptoms are lasting more than a 2 to 3 week span, it might be time to consider getting professional help. And the good news is, given COVID-19, there are all sorts of options out there. Obviously, in-person is more challenging, although there are some, particularly residential programs, that are still accepting patients suffering from extreme anxiety. But there are a ton of virtual options that have been opened up through telehealth options, with the insurance carriers sort of lessening the restrictions around that. So if you're thinking about your employees, I think the ways to be concerned at this very moment, given COVID-19, are those employees who might be focusing solely on bad news. These are the employees who leave CNN or some news source streaming all day in their living room, and they're seeing one story after the next. They're seeing the body counts come in, and they're also seeing what I consider to be some of the most heartbreaking stories about husband and wife teams who are in a hospital who both die at the same time. The human brain and our emotional state is not built to have that much bad news just bombarding us at all time, particularly with the uncertainty around when things will change. We see a whole host of folks who have they have just a very skewed perception of what's happening and no capacity to think beyond the immediate present. We talked a little bit about ruminating. I would say for folks that are experiencing extreme anxiety, they may get to a point where they're neglecting their personal and self-care needs. I joke all the time that this is a moment where all of us might be dressing a little more casually than we had before. Even if the top of us looks very professional, the bottom might be a little bit different than it was. And that's not what I'm referring to when I say neglecting personal or self-care needs. I'm really talking about people who are struggling with showering, basic hygiene, committing to exercise and healthy activities. So how do you create calmer waters? I will say, having been in this field for a long time, I get exposure to a range of financial firms, all sorts of companies. We do a lot of work with family businesses. I just hosted a webinar for one of them on Monday. And the companies that seem to be having the most success are those that are doing almost bordering too much communication. So being very proactive in their email and phone communication with employees and with clients. On the right, there's an image of a financial firm that sent this out to clients, but I think it's just as important to consider if you have employees, what's your messaging around COVID? Or do you have a group of folks that are considered essential workers? How are you attempting to keep them safe? We'll get into some specific strategies, but reaching out, spending more time, in our firm, and we're a tiny company, we're sending out company wins every 2 weeks, which is a new precedent for us. So who had a personal milestone? We had an employee who had a baby, who worked well with the client and saw some success and some movement. How do we celebrate those small milestones in a way that's meaningful, that kind of keeps morale up? And how do we communicate about what we're doing to protect ourselves, both from a health and from an economic perspective? I think reminding employees that there are precedents, especially those who are really concerned about the economic impact, and that this is something that it feels right now for many of us like the time horizon is indefinite and we can't say an end to it, but it will have an ending and we will go back to some form of normalcy after a period of time. I think of this as particularly relevant to those employees who are ready to make a big decision. They're going to transfer all their money out of a certain account. They're going to quit their job and do something totally different. This is, in my opinion, a time for folks to sort of hunker down, stay as connected to folks in their community, and for employers and the HR departments to really try and quell the waters, calm people down, and remind them that maybe a time to sort of take a pause and really think about, is this the right decision to make now, or would they want to do so when things are a little bit more certain? And then the last piece I would say is just listening and remaining a really sensitive employer. I think a lot of folks want to be, I always joke that my personality is more of a plumber than a philosopher. So I like to fix things. I want to come up with a solution. And for some people, that's really effective. But other folks, even anxious folks, really just want an ear. They just want someone to be able to offload at the end of the day. This is what I'm struggling with. And they want to know that someone is going to support them. So now I'm just going to go through some tips for maintaining employee morale. I think one of the areas that we've tried to be sensitive to are those employees who might be more significantly impacted by this crisis than others. It doesn't mean you don't do the email communication to everybody. Doesn't mean that supervisors don't have more regular supervision and check in by phone. But I think particular outreach for a few groups is important. Those in the sandwich generation, so those folks who have small children in the home and they have older adults. I think anybody right now who has a loved one in an assisted living facility or a nursing home is really concerned about their health and their well-being and feeling powerless with the fact that they can't actually be with that person in person. So I think reaching out to those folks, partners or first responders or other types of essential employees, if somebody's a police officer, if somebody runs a dry cleaning business and that their partner is working at your firm, reaching out and just saying, can we support you in this time? Is there anything you need? I think certainly reminding employees of what wellness offerings you have baked in. I hear a lot amongst employers around the low utilization of EAP services. It may be a time to consider whether or not you need to add to that cadre of offerings, but reminding people proactively, here's the number. We are here to offer more services if needed. Perhaps even seeing if there are communities or groups of people who could host webinars related to lowering anxiety, building up your immunity, but really trying to do the most that you can to show employees that you're trying to protect their health and well-being. We talked about employee milestones. I think, I put in consider small gifts with employees. It's a tough economic time for everybody. I think everybody is going to be reluctant to give major economic incentives unless you're Amazon or Drizzly or one of these businesses that's probably really doing well during these times. But in our company, we're very small. We decided to send everybody a box of soup, basically. So Spoonful of Comfort sends a big jar of soup, a ladle, some rolls, and cookies. And I will be honest, we've given bonuses in past years when the company has done well. I got more thank yous and kind emails from folks who were touched that we were thinking about them than I did with anything else. And it's a pretty low-cost idea. Certainly asking feedback from employees for what might be helpful for them is an important thing to consider as well. Some of the more creative activities I've seen, and some of this really depends on the culture of your firm. I mean, some companies are hosting these 5-minute afternoon dance parties. I was recently on a Zoom call where they did an abbreviated version of Cribs. Believe it or not, people had their iPads and they were walking them around their house, introducing them to their children, their pets, but as a way to sort of stay connected in a less formal, Zoom call, business meeting agenda type event. I've seen employers who have hosted morning or afternoon mindfulness or yoga sessions, even encourage online video games. I will say that tends to be with companies with a younger demographic, but I think it could be helpful for older groups. We have seen a whole host of companies that are hosting virtual happy hour or coffee hours, obviously trying to be mindful, again, of not encouraging too much alcohol consumption. One company we know started a step contest and had folks competing for online gift cards as a way to kind of keep them engaged. And another one brought in a nutritionist to talk about what are foods you can be using at this time to boost your immunity, and allowing employees to engage like there was a specific event for their firm. I think for those folks that you really think have gone beyond, what we would call situational anxiety and are in a or they have extreme situational anxiety and are exhibiting some of those more significant symptoms that we discussed earlier, I've just put out some resources here. Mass General, we're very lucky to have Mass General here in Boston. They've done an excellent job on their website of creating a whole host of resources, including things like how do you talk to a 5-year-old child about what COVID is and explain why they can't go to the park with their friends. They have just an enormous amount of different types of resources on their website. For those based in Boston or in Los Angeles, the Boston Child Study Center does some great therapeutic work with children, and they have some virtual offerings that I think can be really helpful in a time when children aren't necessarily going into a hospital-based setting. eHome Counseling is a great resource. They have licensed clinicians all over the country that can do teletherapy and telehealth. And then our company is certainly happy to be a resource. I put on the bottom a page of additional vetted resources that are external to our company for review. I'll spend a couple minutes on just talking about in general, if you're dealing, and this is probably more relevant for folks on the call themselves or those in their personal network, and it's possible you may know an employee to suggest some of these, but I think there's a lot of media attention, rightfully so, sort of targeted towards what are the evidence-based techniques to address anxiety. So staying connected to family and friends and community in creative ways. I just got invited yesterday to a steak and scotch virtual event from 9 to 11 tomorrow night. Creating and maintaining a routine, eating healthy, exercising. Sleep hygiene is one I want to point out. I think for some of us, this is a time of increased stress because you're 2 parents working remotely, now homeschooling children, so time is not a luxury that you have. For others of us who aren't having to leave the house to commute to various appointments, we actually have more bandwidth in the day, and it's a good time to start looking at, what sleep hygiene practices am I doing? Am I really putting the phone away? Am I shutting TV off? Am I in a cold room? All those types of things. Meditation, I try and do it every day, 15 minutes at a clip. Very difficult to do the second time, but in the morning I do. An Insight timer, for those of you who don't know it, is a great resource that gives a range of guided meditations and times that you can engage in, from 5 minutes up to 60. Some of the more creative anxiety hacks that our team has sort of collated over the past few weeks, using ice. We've seen some people who really thrive in getting their houses organized. I would say there are other folks like myself who that is just a drudgery task and is likely going to put me in a bad mood for the day. So this may not be the time to engage in that. Jigsaw puzzles seem to be a common one that folks really get excitement out of. And I always say, for those of us who are lucky to have pets, I put them in the other room today because I didn't want them to be disruptive. It's a good time to really spend some time with them. They can be very calming. We also listed a bunch of family resources, from virtual tours that you can do of the San Diego Zoo to some of the storybook reading. For those of you who didn't see it, Dolly Parton is actually hosting a story hour. We're seeing some other celebrities who can read a book at the end of night with your child, and you can sort of stream it online. But these are ways to provide some structure during a time when I think a lot of family members are really struggling with being creative and filling up a very long day, particularly with small children. The last thing I'll close on is, when COVID-19 came out, I will confess, I really resisted it. I will say I was in denial. My parents were away on a vacation. They told me they were going to come home early. I had a very negative reaction and just said, that's ridiculous. This is all blown up out of nothing. I turned out to be incredibly wrong, as we all know, and they were right to come home. But I was really cranky for a couple of days about missing my college reunion and concerts and all, me, all these things I was going to miss. And I finally stopped after about 2 days. And I said, do I want to look back 2 years from now and be embarrassed at my attitude and the way I behaved? Or do I want to feel like I was a good child? I was a good leader. Even if I had to make hard decisions during this crisis, I did so with intention and with some thought put into it. So I asked myself that question, and it really helped to reframe my attitude. And I'm now seeing, I can't say that I don't get stir crazy like the rest of us, but I'm now seeing real opportunities of ways to reposition some of the ways we do projects and marketing at our company to adjust to the times. And I think there are practices we'll use going forward. And the second question is, a lot of families have things that are going very well and then some things that are not going so well. So with this increased family time, are there tweaks that you can make to your family system that might put you in a better position over the long term? This is a little bit about our company. We're based here in Boston, but we work all over the country. We have a team of therapists, but we don't provide ongoing therapy. We do interventions. We place people into treatment centers. We have coaches who go in the home and live with folks. We do a lot of crisis management work, particularly for employers. Happy to talk offline about what we do if it's of interest. So thank you very much. And I hope you all are remaining safe, and happy to take some questions if we have them. Okay. Sydney, do we have any questions in the chat?
No questions right now. Just a reminder that you can either chat them to us, to all panelists, or put them in the question and answer, or if you want to ask your question out loud, you can raise your hand. There should be a little raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen.
We got a thank you. Well, thank you for joining.
Just so, will we get copies? Yeah, I think we're happy to share this PowerPoint with you, and I'll definitely send that out.
Okay.
Do you recall the soup vendor you used?
Oh, I think it's called A Spoonful of Comfort, but I can definitely follow up with the answer if that's not the right one. Sydney, will you just put a note on that?
Yes, I believe it was Spoonful of Comfort.
Okay. Okay, how do we begin the conversations with employees about coming back to work eventually, especially ones with anxiety? It's a great question. Certainly I think we're all going to have to look at what guidance we're getting from the governor in terms of what's allowed and what's not. I think this is a time, in my opinion, to look at people's functions and see how many of your employees could continue doing, especially anxious employees, which was where the question is focused. Is it possible for that employee to do some of their work remotely, all of their work remotely, for an extended period of time? Because I do think, and the reason I say that is even as restrictions are lifted, everyone talks about the new normal. I think we're going to see folks still reluctant to do things that had been commonplace. I'm a big concert theater goer. I think those days are probably going to be pushed off for a lot of folks. I think we're going to see people more reluctant to shake hands at the beginning of a business meeting. So I think to the extent it's feasible, and it's not feasible for everybody in their roles, to try and figure out, can we be sensitive to those employees, particularly if they're productive employees, around being more flexible with their work arrangements, and what could that possibly look like? If it's essential that the person is in the office, I think it's really important to, as a HR function or with your leadership at the company, to figure out what protections are you offering people. Can you reconfigure the way offices are? Can there be split shifts in how many people are in one office at a time? Could people work kind of more flexible hours? Are masks and gloves available? Like, what can be done to continue to help people feel comfortable and safe? And frankly, like, that is your priority. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but that's sort of where I would go. But I think in my mind, we're doing our best. We are essential employees. There are employees that have a varying level of risk tolerance in terms of how comfortable they are meeting clients in person, and we're trying to be as respectful of that as we can while still maintaining the business. Recognizing anxiety and other issues are more challenging when employees are remote. What virtual strategies would you suggest for HR team to recognize the signs? I think, I will say I am Zoomed out and FaceTimed out, but I think really helping, I think people's body language is their ability to make eye contact, seeing them in person really gives you a better sense than doing a phone call. So to the extent, and I think this comes back to the proactive communication, if I were running an HR department and I knew either a cadre of employees are particularly anxious or a cadre of employees were under significant stress, I would be reaching out via Zoom if possible, at a minimum by phone, not just by email on a group email, but really trying to reach out individually and say, I just want to check in, anything we can help you with, anything that you need. Have you made use of our employee resources, whatever messaging you can do, but just showing that heightened level of sensitivity. Yes, great point on being Zoomed out. Any suggestions for managing this? I try to not schedule too many things back to back at our company. Not always possible. Some days I have 3 webinars, and I will tell you at the end of the day, I am ready to lay on the ground and cry. But I do try to make an attempt to give some wiggle room. So I think, to the extent it's possible, not scheduling 3 2-hour Zoom meetings in the same day, like spacing out the ones that people really are spending more time on and being attentive on. I think using Zoom for some of the kind of sillier things, the dance party, a virtual coffee hour, whatever, making it a little more interactive and fun can be helpful, so that it's not just seen as a tool to have everybody sitting there and paying attention. I personally believe meetings on Zoom, if you can keep them to 30 to 60 minutes at all possible, I would rather see us have 2 sales meetings 2 days in a row for shorter duration than one long one, because folks get distracted. They want to check their email. They also are conscious that people are looking at them on a screen. I encourage our employees that on days of internal meetings, myself included, you will see me in the prettiest sweatshirt you've ever seen, with my hair, pulled up in a ponytail. And to the extent it's feasible at your company to allow people some flexibility with that, on days where they have to be externally facing, that's different. And I think all of us have to take care of ourselves on those days, but allowing people some additional flexibility that maybe wouldn't be as permitted in the office. There's a lot of literature out there that suggests having, people who work from home should get up, shower, get dressed, have a specific space in their office. For those of us who don't work remotely all the time, that for me isn't comfortable. I've dealt better with having a little bit more flexibility and being able to use some of the benefits of COVID-19 to exercise in the middle of the day and then change back into business clothes in the afternoon. So to the extent you can vary it up and keep the meeting shorter and have some creative ways to connect via Zoom, I think that's helpful as well.
There's just one that's, do we offer something like this for employees?
Oh, sure. If they wanted employees to get on a webinar with us, absolutely. We'd be happy to do so. Feel free to contact us.
Great, Arden. We appreciate your time. I think this feels like a good time to maybe wrap things up. I'd like to thank you and the O'Connor Group for bringing your expertise to such an important topic. And if people have additional questions, you feel free to reach out to Doug or myself, and we can facilitate that. In the meantime, thanks for your time and stay well, everyone.
Thank you.